Okay, welcome everyone to the session on research at the intersection of planning and real estate studies. The Connect 21 project responsible for this seminar is a UGoveRN initiative, and UGoveRN is the Urban Governance Research Network, and more specifically an initiative of the Planning and Property chapter. So please have a look at the website if you want to find out more. The session focuses on research at the intersection of planning and real estate studies, as particularly focusing on the challenges that early career scholars might experience by bridging different disciplines. We're very grateful to have three mentors that will now start a panel discussion. I would like to introduce Tuna Taschenkok, who is Professor of Urban Governance and Planning at the University of Amsterdam. And next up, we have Michael Ball, who is Professor of Urban and Property Economics at the University of Reading, and Martijn Dors, who is Associate Professor of Real Estate Finance, also from the University of Amsterdam. Please submit your questions in the chat box and we can include them as well. But maybe just to start the discussion, I would like to ask our three mentors, after talking to some of the participants of the seminar and your own experiences, what do you think are the key challenges of interdisciplinary research at the intersection of planning and real estate studies? I don't know if we have a volunteer who wants to go first. Tuna?
I can start. I've spoken to four different researchers, but I think the main constraint or challenge that we focused in these two different sessions was the methodologies that comes with working in interdisciplinary fields. And of course, more pragmatically, how interdisciplinary work is appreciated by different theoretical frameworks. And more specifically, we discussed how we can understand actor networks, or maybe more generally the complexity of the real estate industry actions in their relation to urban planning and regulation. And in that, I think our discussion, I'm of course zooming out and abstracting what we discussed in detail, was that first of all, methodologically, we agreed that it would be very important to establish a very clear position. And in order to establish that clear position, you need to write in very simplistic terms how you see a gap and how you see that you are going to fill that gap. That's one of the main challenges of publishing or doing research in two different fields. We heard that from Michael Ball already in the beginning of this session. He was talking about the challenges of that. And I see that also in the report, that when you simply cannot pick the side. If you are urban studies and critical scholarship, the real estate scholarship is not going to be happy with what you are writing. If you are going to try to satisfy the real estate scholarship, the planning and critical urban studies scholarship is not going to be satisfied with what you are saying. So we discussed that the best way is to establish your position in the beginning, to clarify that you are doing this for interdisciplinary perspectives and that there is a gap in both fields that you observe, make it clear to your reader, and then again simplify your findings so that both sides can see what you are trying to do here with your research. I think that was, if I zoom out from the methods discussion, that's what we discuss. And we discuss also the importance of doing more realistic research, so making observations, establishing arguments, and then looking for theoretical lenses in order to explain those through interdisciplinary perspectives. More specifically on the actor landscapes or understanding the complex actor involvement in real estate development in relation to urban development. We discussed that you need to employ new methodological fields. Those who are using quantitative methods will, let's say from real estate scholarship, will not satisfy the expectations of planners or urban studies scholars, because those expect critical reflections, also more abstract understandings of theoretical discussions and gaps. And it's the other way around for the real estate scholarship. So for that reason, for example, new methods like ethnography, using more participant observation, maybe psychology, in order to understand and provide some new answers to existing questions we discussed. I think I'll stop here because we had more details, but I think these were the two main characteristics of our discussion.
Yes, great to know. Yes, Martijn, please go ahead.
I can. It's actually interesting to see that we had some overlap there in terms of what we discussed, right? In terms of interdisciplinary research and serving two audiences. One of the things that we did discuss, though, is that to look very carefully at if you are aiming to publish, at what journal you are aiming to publish. So if you are looking at the real estate journals, they have a very particular way in framing an issue. So even if you do multidisciplinary research, you should then start with the real estate type of framing in your introduction, and then discuss the additional framing, which is the other side, for example, the planning side. Or vice versa, if you focus more on the planning journals, you could you frame it more first from a planning perspective and then discuss the real estate side of it. So I've actually referred to a couple of papers who do it in this way. For example, a finance paper which framed it from a financial perspective, but actually was an urban economics paper as well, right? Which is kind of multidisciplinary, urban economics and finance. But then it's first framed at a finance type of journal. So I think you can do a lot by, framing in the introduction of a paper. Another thing which I noticed in many of the things I read, and it's also something you suggest, is to always think about the KISS principle. And before I get like the #MeToo type of responses from you, what I mean is keep it simple, stupid, right? That is what KISS means. And so I noticed that in many cases, you try to write as many difficult words as you can in a single phrase, but I would try to go the other way around, right? To write it as simple as possible, as clean as possible, and not to have too many difficult words in one sentence. And that's something you need to learn. But if you look at good articles and articles which are also published in good journals, they focus very much. So they have a very clear and simple, actually, setup instead of a more complex type of setup, also in terms of language, right? And a second thing we talked about is the difficulty if you are in the planning field, so writing planning papers, that you will have problems, or you will mainly focus on complex structures and actors. And if you are in real estate economics, as I am, you do more with quantifiable things, and those things don't necessarily match. So one of the things I always try to push, even if you are in an more complex setting and urban planning setting, is to find quantifiable measures such that you can find some data, such that you can describe the problem you have, or even maybe analyze using type of regression framework or something like that, but at least describe it very very, very well. So I went to one of the presentations of Tuna, right, where she showed some really nice graphs using some data on commercial real estate. And where is real estate invested and where does the investment flow comes from, right? And so I always try to push for that. So have some nice data and descriptives instead of only focusing on the complexities. Also try to focus on some plain data and descriptives there, and try to find a mix between those two. So that would be those were the two things we discussed. But it's good to see, Tuna, that there are similar things, even though we didn't have the same people we talked to. So
that's great. Maybe we just add Michael's reflection to it before we go into a more in-depth discussion.
Yeah, of course. What's interesting as being the third in a set of people making comments is I entirely agree with all the things been said by the other two speakers. So I'm not going to go over them again, but just try and raise some other things as well. The way Martin put it was slightly differently from me, but the thing, obviously, when doing research is have very clear question and hopefully not too many S's at the end of question, i.e. not too many questions. And you can't answer a question by raising another question. It's good in a social context, and you always sound clever if you can think of another question to ask, and it also avoids having to give an answer, but it doesn't work very well in research. So focus is very important, but that means you've got to spend an awful lot of effort just thinking about what is the question I really want to ask from an interest point of view. What question do I want to ask from a is this going to get published point of view? And what question do I want to ask from within a particular field I'm in, or if I want to be interdisciplinary? And also, what question do I want to ask that I can do within my research time, my defined research time? And people, as has been said before, are often a little ambitious in that respect. So I think that's very important. Now, when we come to an issue called multidisciplinary research, to say I think that there's a multidisciplinary research when you're engaging planning with real estate is, yes, it's true, but there are many disciplines within both contexts as well. And I'm obviously going to speak from my context as an economist. And when you're looking at real estate, economics and obviously finance is closely linked to that, are key issues within the real estate arena. And one of the things I've noticed, and not so much here, but just from general experience of dealing with students and also non-specialists, is that people often find economics a bit terrifying. But there are some very good introductory things that aren't terrifying, that are very user-friendly. And if you're dealing with stuff like real estate markets, you very often don't have to deal with particularly complex economics to deal with the questions that you're concerned with. And I had a great education, even at this stage of my research. Recently, I wrote a paper with a planner, a chartered surveyor, and myself about the relationship between land prices and house prices. It's just been published in the Town Planning Review. So it's it even gone into a planning arena. And it was just very educative to see how we all talked about what was the same thing, but we actually talked in completely different ways. So we had to spend quite a bit of time just learning the way in which we were talking. In other words, if you're going to deal with economics and you want, it's often a good idea, as the same with other subjects, to learn the language a bit. It's not very difficult, and often people are critical because they don't think it's relevant to talk to those people. But you can often say things in a non-critical way. So, as Tuna said, some people expect, you to always waggle your finger at some bad thing and so on. Often in the real estate side, that sort of discourse isn't necessarily there. It's sort of adding to knowledge, but you can do that very, very easily just by talking in the language that people in that area find acceptable. Now, two more big themes I think are very important, again coming from the real estate side, is that property development or anything in property markets doesn't always go in the same direction. So, you know, inequality caused by rising house prices. So the people who argue about that, when house prices start to fall, does inequality improve? I don't think the relationship is so linear personally, but and you can go on and on about this, but there are these things called property cycles, and there are other reasons why investment and development in real estate is highly risky. This type of thing is bread and butter for people in the real estate, economics and finance areas, but it's very often not accepted at all within other subject disciplines. There's actually risk there. Land value capture, are you capturing it risk weighted or unrisk weighted? All this sort of stuff is terribly important when we deal with these policies. Now, quickly, a couple of other things. I was taught this in my introductory economics courses, particularly macroeconomics, but it applies to anything. If you've got one policy instrument, you can affect one thing. Okay, so if you've got interest rate policy, this is what central banks do, their prime goal is to affect inflation, not to affect, you know, lots of other things that they might want to do. And the reason for that is policy tools have limited ability. Now, when we look at things within not just simply planning policy, but urban policy in general, we see one policy tool may be able to have zoning or something like that, or maybe have a subsidy program. And the aims of it are often multitude, you know, hundreds of them, or at least quite a limited number of them. And the world is going to be such a better place at the end of it all. We all know from reading these documents. Now, one of the things about being critical is being about that approach. If you were dealing with policy can't do everything to everybody and make everybody happy at the same time, and it's only a few nasty people that are spoiling the whole show. It's not how the world works. So when you think of policy, you've got to think about it in terms of achieving specific and limited aims. And finally, within that type of context, I raise a general thing again that economists would raise a lot is when we see some say some poverty around, or with some low-income people, and we're very concerned about them, what sort of policy should we adopt? Should we adopt an urban policy like giving them cheap housing? Or should we subsidize their incomes, or make sure that they get proper training, or if they're young people, they get proper education so they can deal in the labor market more successfully? Now, there are huge trade-offs between each of those, but those trade-offs have to be thought about, because you can't do everything. Again, it's this policy instrument type stuff. You can't do everything, and which is better? Now, I deal a lot in housing, and if you talk to people who are concerned about low-income groups, improving their housing is by far the most important, but it might not be. That's and I don't mean that disparagingly against those people. You might actually not necessarily be doing them a favor. Now, it was very explicit, going through a bit of urban history in the 1950s, that you build social housing because it keeps firms' labor costs down. Okay, so were you building the housing for the people, for the who lived in those houses, or were you building them to reduce labor costs for firms? Okay, it was one of the, it's documented in the Netherlands, UK, and quite a number of other places as one of the reasons why that sort of social policy took place in post-war Europe. Now, what I'm saying is that there are feedback effects, there are further effects from policies, and it might not be the people you think that you're helping that actually get the benefit at the end of the day. So again, that's always something to think about. Don't stay in a silo. Think critically in the more general sense, and think about wider effects as they go along. Okay, end of sermon, so I'll stop here.
Okay, that was great. I think we already got so many hints and tips of how to conduct research, how to write it up, a publishing strategy, but also in terms of implementation. What I would like to discuss in a bit more detail is just this feeling of being incomplete and not fully fitting to both disciplines or sub-disciplines of planning and real estate studies. Tuna said you cannot satisfy both sides. I think some of the participants talked about their struggles of how it makes you feel. And I think especially as an early career researcher, being criticized for your unique approach that is interdisciplinary and defending that position is very challenging at times. So what would you recommend in terms of gaining confidence and dealing with criticism coming from either disciplinary side?
Shall I go first?
Oh, Michael.
Please.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. The first thing is develop a tough skin if you're an academic. The whole point of being an academic is to have ideas and to think about things and to do research. But also just the very nature of it is that means you question past conventional wisdom. Past tradition, and that's not just cross subject area, that's within subject areas. If you put a group of I think anybody from any subject area and put them in a room for a few hours, there'd be quite a few heated debates going on by the time you get to the end of it. So it's part of being an academic, and it's something that you have to learn to deal with. And you know, frankly, being disappointed or upset by what people say about you never goes away. It goes with the job. So you just have to develop a frame of mind to do that. That's one point. The second point, as has been said before, to try and speak the language of the person that you're speaking to or addressing in writing, and that's very, very important, because often it's just that people do talk in different ways, and it's important to pick up on the ways in which they talk. A third one is, if you're really keen on writing in an area and applying to journals which you would not normally apply to, think of finding a research colleague who actually works in that field and who is interested in the topic that you're interested in. Yes, you might have to split the publication, but the probability of you getting the publication will be vastly higher than if you tried to do it yourself. And there's an awful lot of opportunities for doing that. And it's very noticeable when you look at the journals now that there's a lot more multi-author writing than there was, say, 40 odd years ago, and you know, for better or worse. I mean, one can debate that, but it's clearly a trend that's developing. So just make sure that who you work with on occasion has some basis in a particular subject area. Finished.
So maybe in addition to that, how do you get these other type of colleagues to work with? They might not be in your field. So one of the things I did a lot is just going to many different conferences, right? So go to things like the European Real Estate Society, where you have industry seminars and also have academic scholars from many different fields. Right, so that is one thing I did to build, you know, a network of different co-authors. So that is one suggestion. Another more practical suggestion, in terms of if you feel incomplete in terms of your research, one thing you could do, and I often do, is in my paper have a very detailed limitation and future research type of section. So not just discussing it a little bit in your conclusion, but really have a dedicated section where you show that you understand that there's, you know, maybe more to life than what you have written. And for me, that has worked out a couple of times in my favor. right? Having an empirical background, but then doing theoretical research. I'm basically not a theory guy, but then, you know, describing the things that I could have done additionally and things that I might not have done helped a lot in framing and giving a sense to the referees that I really thought about this topic in my paper. So one of the things that helped from a practical point of view is adding this type of limitation and future research section. And always call it future research and not only limitations, because you do not want to destroy your own work. You just want to say that you understand that you know, there's a broader world out there that and that you understand that it is like that, right? So that is what I did from a practical point of view, going to conferences a lot and having this limitation of future research section in my multidisciplinary research, let's say, right? Yeah. So Tuna, anything to add still?
Yeah, it's you are making my life more difficult, but I have a couple of things to add. First of all, I think one of the main challenges of publishing in the interdisciplinary field is to make yourself clear to your reader. And of course, if you choose a journal, that journal has a specific language, specific scholarship that is attracting. I think it's a very wise thing to do is to understand that language. I mean, in more practical terms, have an idea about the journal that you are going to submit the article before you write the paper for, and then make a detailed research in that journal, what is published in this field and how do they actually approach this. You need to understand that language. Once you do that, you need to translate your language into their language. And I'm saying this out of experience, because if you don't do that, they won't understand you, or they won't spend the effort to understand you. They will reject you. They will simply say, oh, this is not critical enough, or oh, you don't know actually the reality, which of course is not the case. You just have to make yourself clear. I think the third thing I would add to that is define your position very clearly. Don't think that it is clear to everyone. Make in the beginning of your article which position you are taking and how you are explaining yourself through your research. In other words, let's say that you are writing for a planning journal, but you are using a lot of real estate data. And of course, the biggest critique you would get is that you are too pragmatic, you don't understand the theoretical grounds, and you are not really filling a theoretical gap here. Why does it matter? So think of that critique yourself, and you can do that by knowing how they publish, and then explain in the beginning of your article, in this article on purpose, I'm focusing on this and that because there is a gap on this field, and I'm writing this from the position of an urban planner. Because if you don't do that, the reader of the journal will read it from their own point of view. Say that they are real estate scholars reading a planning article, they will read it as real estate scholars, and you are not making yourself very clear to them. So very simple things, but I think that these kind of very pragmatic solutions will make your readability, publishability higher in interdisciplinary fields. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, so it really sounds like turning your potential weaknesses more into a strength, and really, highlighting your unique approach instead of trying to camouflage it in a way, pretending you know everything from both fields. That's how I understand it. You all gave really important keys or recommendations in terms of publishing. And I think for all of us, it's really interesting to think about publishing. So we had the adopting a common language, keeping it very simple, being very careful when selecting the journal. And especially Martijn pointed out, for instance, if you want to publish in a real estate journal with a planning background, highlight the data. So I want to ask a few more questions about data, because actually collecting data or having access to data is not always that easy. I can only speak from the planning perspective, but real estate data, accessing these types of data, if you have no connections and you don't know the field very well, is kind of challenging. So I would just like to ask you about your recommendations of finding suitable data sources and like strategies you can employ in order to access new data.
Shall I go again?
Yes, please.
Okay. Data's obviously central to research, particularly in PhD research, and particularly in these sorts of fields. But the more important thing is, why do you want that data? And so, first of all, rather than go out there and see what data's around, or make sure that you've got your research questions very clear to yourself and that they're doable, because you can't find data for things that are just not doable. You know, how and that you've got a very broad question that essentially can't be asked. So really sort out first what data you want. Now, it might seem that there are data limitations galore, but since the advent of the internet, it's been an absolute boon for researchers in terms of trying to get information. And also the existence of the internet has forced a lot of data providers, and particularly in the public sphere, to greatly improve the quality and the extent of the data that they provide. So your first port of call would be within these areas is whatever, if you're doing comparative work across countries, or even work within countries, is to go to your national statistical sources. And there's also, I think, induced by the sheer cost of getting all this data together, there's been a great deal of centralization across countries into national statistical bodies having a much greater role in picking on pieces of data. For example, in the UK, it used to be the case that the housing ministry produced housing statistics, this ministry produced that, and that ministry produced that, and you'd have to go and dash around and get books and try and put them in spreadsheets and things like this, and it would drive you absolutely mad. And now the National Statistical Office gets the lot, and you can download it off of the internet, and I think that's greatly improved. Things like Eurostat introducing common house price indices across the EU region. I don't know what the UK is doing with that at the moment. I think they're still pouting in the corner about whether they're going to carry on doing that, but I sincerely hope they will do, because having those sorts of data standardized is absolutely fantastic. So that's the first port of call. The second port of call, which again might seem a bit surprising, but particularly if you're looking at countries in a comparative basis, are places like the World Bank, who have a fantastic data source on countries these days, and it's forever expanding. And if you're interested in particular areas, it's amazing how much central banks in their reports write about the property markets. But it's not amazing, because of course it's a major source of interaction between finance and the real economies takes place through property markets. So you tend to get one-off articles or again data from those sources as well. So it's worth checking up working papers from European Central Bank, the Fed, or Bank of England, or wherever you're interested in, to find out that sort of information. And the great thing about that is that it's written for, not all of them, but often written for general audiences. So it's not written in, another subject's gobbledygook. You can actually generally understand these things quite easy. So those are the sorts of data sources. getting access to private data sources is typically not very successful, but also has a limited shelf life, because you tend to be able to get access for a particular point in time and not others. So it all depends what you want to do, but it's not typically not the road to success. I'm dealing at the moment in some research on the time it takes to build out development sites with some very interesting non-public source of data. But again, it's a one-off, and so you don't necessarily find that. But one final thing before I close off is that it's important when you get data to check out what it means. There are definitions and all these sorts of things which are remarkably varied. COVID deaths across Europe, don't believe the numbers in the newspapers, because the way in which they're gathered, of course, and what's defined as COVID related varies enormously between countries. But that's just one thing we're all acutely aware of at the moment. But it's also the case with real estate data, that it's collected and gathered in different ways, and so you can't necessarily say this is comparable with that unless you've checked it out pretty well. That's why, going back to Eurostat's house price indices, that was such good news, because they are insisting, of course, that they are estimated in approximately the same ways. I've finished now, so over to somebody else.
So I actually think there is well, more data than you can imagine. Actually, there's and the accessibility has increased over the years very much. So the thing is not getting data, but getting the right data, I suppose. So there's a lot of data. So Mike already suggested Eurostat. I would also like to suggest the Bank of International Settlements, the OECD. You have the American Housing Survey, which is very detailed if you're interested. If you're interested more in housing. So actually, there's quite a lot of data for you to work on. One of the things, though, is you typically need to add your own data to these data sources. And that is the difficult part. So if you're focusing on a particular planning aspect or a particular policy change, and quantifying that in a particular way, that might be very difficult. And that is where you need to search. For example, in the Netherlands, we all have access to transactions data, housing transactions data. You have that in many countries, also in the UK, right? But then trying to see what the effect of wind turbines is on house prices, yeah, where do you get your wind turbine data? And that is really something of a search. And finding that is not easy. Typically, you go to either the government data or administrative data, or some research company, or you go to different websites to find the locations of all the different wind turbines, or even collecting things by hand, going website by website, or scraping websites. So I would say making your research unique is not going to Eurostat and getting all the house price data, but getting this type of extra data that no one else has. And you see that if you do that in a good way and find some interesting thing, like, for example, wind turbines or solar farms and house prices, or one of my papers, refugee centers and the willingness to pay for that. That is what makes it what makes it very interesting and also highly publishable. So that is one of the things in terms of data. You have more. There's more than enough data, but getting the right data might be difficult. So let me think. Did I mention all one source I forgot is what I also like is the European Mortgage Federation, or Hypostat. They have kind of market reports, which contains a bit more than you might find just on Eurostat, and particularly related, of course, to mortgages and loan-to-value ratios and debt, right? And those you might not easily find on Eurostat, but you might find them, and also transaction volumes, right? So the price indices at Eurostat, they don't mention if I remember correctly, the transaction volumes, so the liquidity part of real estate. And that's of course very important for specifically for residential, for example, real estate, but also commercial, that there is a liquidity that is really less liquid, and this affects the market behavior, right? And the market and the price developments you see, right? And you can find those on a cross-country basis in these hypostat reports. So it's really searching for these other aspects that others do not have. So many people look at Eurostat, but not many people, they download all the hypostat reports and type over all the debt and all those type of things, right? And that's where you can make then a contribution in terms of analyzing cross-country price dynamics and dynamics of debts and mortgages, right? So that would be what I would like to say in terms of, you know, data availability and having the right type of data. That is yeah, important to keep in mind.
Yes, and of course, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I can give you recommendations about how I found a way. Martijn was just giving a compliment on a presentation I made with some data. And of course, I could do that because I think the starting point of finding data is to know what you want to have out of the data. What do you want to make analysis for? So I knew what I wanted to have. I wanted to analyze the actor landscapes, the investors, and I wanted to create a category, but I don't have the tool sets. I'm not a quantitative researcher, but I work with quantitative people. So basically, having the data set, yes, we were able to buy a big data set because of the research project we have. But later on, I learned from Martijn that we could actually get the housing transaction data free in the Netherlands as well. So we paid for a big data set. But I simply explained to my partners in research, mainly our quantitative researcher, Andre Legarza, this is what we want to do. Sarah and I developed a kind of methodology of creating these categories. How do we quantify this? And together, having a language, basically, of establishing a language of how we could look into a very complex landscape through data, we came up with a method. So it means that before looking for the data, you need to know what do you want to do with the data? What do you want to highlight it? And then maybe search for, if you are a qualitative researcher, I'm not talking for those quantitative people, you know what you are doing, but for people like us, for planners, mainly coming from qualitative background, you need support. You need support from quantitative researchers. And once you establish that, once you have that narrative that this is what I want to analyze and this is what I observe, I want to operationalize that, then I think looking for the right data sources is a very important step. Secondly, I fully agree with Martijn on establishing databases. I think there is so much out there just by making internet search and sitting without even using researchers. I did a research on my own, just sitting behind my computers using Google, literally, looking for companies and their data usage. I established my own databases. I mean, I picked the data, I put it in the Excel sheet one by one. And after a couple of months' work, I had my databases, which doesn't exist anywhere else. I made that. And that makes you, of course, strong. But again, in order to do that, you need to have the vision of what you want to take out of that databases. So think of the argument, think of your observations, unique things that you see, and then search for data. I think that's the only thing I can say as a qualitative researcher.
Thank you to all of you. Unfortunately, we're already at the end, but these were really valuable insights. And I have one more question to ask, and I hope you can answer it very briefly. But since we're all early career scholars here in the room, I want to ask you, what is the one thing that you would have liked to be told as an early career researcher? So what do you recommend us? And it can go in any direction as you want. Michael, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, sure. What would I have liked to have been taught? But I was very lucky that I actually started in my career in a research team, so I just had to look at everybody else and see what they were doing, and that was very useful. So in that sense, I would think that try not to just plough a lonely furrow. Try and make sure that you're doing stuff in groups, either groups of people who are already established as academics, or in terms of fellow researchers. You know, just talk out ideas and work through ideas, or even try and do little projects together, just so you can pick up the way and learn a lot from that. I think that's a great way to get in. I'm sure if I had to start out in some lonely little office in front of a computer, I might have chosen a different career. But you know, when I was plunged into the middle of this great social as well as academic event, it was enormously productive for me.
Thank you. Martijn.
Yeah, so the difficulty here is that I have to say I've had different mentors and for short periods of time. So I didn't have really one particular mentor. So I did basically did everything I could, right? And then half of it failed and the other half worked well. So so what worked well is, and that would be my advice, is to go to many different conferences and talk to your fellow scholars, meaning also the early career scholars in your case, and try to write something together. And it relates a bit to what Michael is saying. You shouldn't be writing by yourself. Write with some other PhD scholar, or try to find a more senior scholar to write with in your country, that will help you a lot. So in the end, what I did, I first wrote a lot with my fellow PhD students, and then I switched and wrote more with more senior scholars in the field. And I did this by just sharing my research ideas and talking at these different conferences and sharing my research ideas and going from there. Okay, so that is one thing. And I just to add, my PhD promoter so many years ago, that is what he actually said to me: go out there, right? And at that time, I really didn't understand that much, right? But in the end, he turned out to be right. So you just need to go to many different conferences and show what you are doing. That is one of the advices I would like to emphasize, I would say.
Great, thank you. Tuna.
Okay. Again, my job is more difficult, but I have three things to say. Maybe it's a bit overlapping with what Michael and Martijn said. Have a good network, but not a strategic network, but a network of friends, academic friends. You don't have to be best friends, but you need friends all over the world where you can share your challenges or opportunities. That's very important. Secondly, have role models. I never regret having role models in the academy. Not that the people that I know, sometimes people I don't know. I like to see myself like that. And that's my third point. Have a vision about where you want to see yourself. And I'm not talking about in a very strategic way of next 5 years, I want to achieve that kind of sense, that you should have too, but more in a more general vision of this is what a kind of an academic I want to become. If you have that vision, you will fulfill that. I guarantee you. So have that vision, search for it. It's very important.
Thank you, Tuna. Perfect ways to end this part of the seminar. And I think also the perfect transition to go over to the early career network presentations. I would like to thank Michael, Martijn, and Tuna so much for their time and efforts. And you're basically free to go, but of course, if you want to stay around, you're welcome to do so as well. So thank you very much.